Clause 7. The paint was the wrong shade of white. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that a reasonable person would notice from the street, or even from the driveway. But it was wrong in the way that Sandra Reeves had come to understand all things in Pinecrest Commons were wrong, which is to say it was wrong because Diana Hartwell said it was wrong, and in this particular zip code, that was the only definition that mattered. Sandra had noticed the Range Rover before she noticed the woman. It was hard not to. The vehicle was the color of fresh cream, immaculate in a way that suggested it had never been driven on an actual road, and it sat idling at the curb with the quiet, entitled hum of something that had never been asked to justify its existence. The personalized plate read PNCRST1. Sandra had been in Pinecrest Commons for 11 days, and she had already learned what that plate meant. She was on a ladder when the car door opened. 12 feet up, roller in her right hand, the late September sun pressing warm against the back of her neck. The house needed work. She had known that when she bought it. A 1994 colonial on a corner lot at the edge of the development, priced below market because the previous owners had let it slide for the better part of 4 years. The house had good bones, which was the thing real estate agents said when they meant a place had been neglected but had not yet given up entirely. She had a plan for it. She always had a plan. That was, in many ways, the thing that had defined her since she was old enough to understand that the world did not automatically arrange itself into the shapes that were most useful to you. The woman who stepped out of the Range Rover moved the way certain people move when they have spent years practicing the art of being noticed. Her blazer was the pale gray of a winter sky. Her hair was a careful auburn, pulled back with the kind of precision that announces effort while pretending to announce effortlessness. She carried a clipboard. Of course she carried a clipboard. Sandra climbed down from the ladder. Not quickly, and not slowly. She wiped her hands on her jeans and stood at the base of the ladder and waited. She had spent 18 years in federal law enforcement. One of the first things they teach you in federal law enforcement is that the person who moves toward the confrontation is almost always at a disadvantage. She had moved toward a great many confrontations over 18 years, but she had always moved on her own terms, and she was not on anyone else's terms now. The woman stopped at the edge of the driveway. She smiled with her whole face except her eyes. "You must be the new owner." The voice was the vocal equivalent of the Range Rover. Smooth, maintained, expensive. "I am Diana Hartwell. I am the president of the Pinecrest Commons Homeowners Association. We run a very tight ship here. Sandra Reeves." Sandra did not offer her hand. "I know who you are." A small pause. The smile did not change. "Well, I wanted to stop by personally to welcome you to the community. We do love to make new residents feel at home." She glanced at the house with the precise expression of someone who wants you to know they are being gracious while wanting you to know something else entirely. "I also want to make sure you have a copy of our community standards. Moving can be hectic, and sometimes things get missed." She produced a stapled packet from under the clipboard and held it out. Sandra took it. "I have already read the CC&Rs, Sandra said. "Downloaded them from the county recorder database 3 weeks before closing." Another small pause. "That is very thorough." The smile adjusted itself slightly, the way a picture gets shifted on a wall when something else in the room has moved. "Still, there are always community-specific guidelines that supplement the recorded documents. That packet contains our current standards. You will notice on page 4 that exterior paint colors require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The shade you have started with is not on the approved palette." Sandra looked at the roller. She looked at the house. She looked back at Diana Hartwell. "I have not started exterior painting," she said. "This is interior grade primer. I am priming the porch ceiling. It is not visible from the street. From my car at that angle, I was able to observe it." "From the street?" "From the curb line, yes." Sandra took a breath. Slow and quiet, the kind you learn to take in interview rooms when someone is lying to you and they know that you know and you both know that the point of the lie is not to deceive but to establish dominance. She had sat in a lot of interview rooms. She had across the table from people who were quite good at this particular move and people who were not good at it at all, and she had learned to tell the difference and to respond to both with the same measured patience, because patience was the thing that made the difference in the end. "I will keep the standards in mind," she said. Diana Hartwell's smile returned to full power. "Wonderful. You will also want to note that contractors must be pre-approved, work hours are limited to 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening, and debris must not be visible from the street during active projects. A beat. We hold our community to a very high standard. That is what makes Pinecrest Commons special." She turned and walked back to the Range Rover with the unhurried confidence of a person who has never, in recent memory, been required to reconsider a position. The car pulled away from the curb without a sound. Sandra stood in her driveway for a moment. She looked at the standards packet in her hand. She looked at the porch ceiling, which was in fact not visible from the street in any way that a reasonable person would describe as visible. She looked at the place where the Range Rover had been. Then she picked up her roller and went back up the ladder, because the primer needed 2 coats and she had planned to finish the ceiling today, and Diana Hartwell's visit had not changed that plan. She was 44 years old. Her full name was Sandra Marie Reeves and she had been born in Durham, North Carolina, the second of 3 daughters of a high school history teacher and a registered nurse, both of whom had taught her, in different ways and at different moments, that understanding how systems work is not the same as accepting what those systems produce, and that the gap between the two is where most of the real work of a life takes place. She had studied accounting at the University of Virginia and then law for 2 years before deciding that the law itself was less interesting to her than the people who broke it, which had led her to the FBI Academy at Quantico at the age of 25, and to 18 years in financial crimes, and to 31 federal prosecutions, and then to a meeting with a deputy director and a decision she had made before he finished his sentence. She had left the bureau with her pension pending and her clearance intact and a consulting contract with a private firm in McLean that kept her in work she understood and liked. She had left her marriage 2 years before that, not in anger but in the quiet recognition that 2 people could care about each other genuinely and still be wrong for each other in ways that mattered, and that staying was not kindness if the staying was what was wrong. She had a daughter, Maya, who was 15 and currently in Richmond with her father for the week, which was the arrangement that worked for their particular version of a family that had reconstituted itself after the divorce into something more honest than it had been before. She had bought the corner lot house because it was priced right and needed work and because she had wanted, after 18 years of federal government and 2 years of the end of her marriage, to be somewhere that was hers in the direct, unmistakable sense. A place with her name on the deed. A place where the work she did was on something she owned. She had not anticipated Diana Hartwell. But she had, in her experience, never anticipated exactly the form the complication would take. The existence of the complication was something she had come to count on. She put the primer on in 2 careful coats and let it dry and went inside and read the standards packet from cover to cover. Then she read it again. She made notes in the margins. Small notes, precise, the kind of notations that are second nature when you have spent the better part of 2 decades building cases that had to survive appellate review. The packet was 32 pages long. 11 of those pages had been added after the original document had been created. She could tell by the formatting inconsistency in the different font weight on the section headers, and by the fact that certain cross-references within the added pages pointed to section numbers that did not exist in the original document. There was no amendment date on any of the added pages. No record of a community vote on any of the provisions they contained. No signature from the full board of directors, only Diana Hartwell's signature on an authorization line that the original document had not contained. Sandra put the packet on the table and opened her laptop and began to pull documents. It took 45 minutes to gather the original CC&Rs from the county recorder database, the articles of incorporation for Pinecrest Commons HOA from the Virginia State Corporation Commission, the most recent annual reports filed with the state, and the business registrations for every vendor listed in the 2 most recent budget summaries, which were posted on the HOA website in a section marked Member Resources. She made a spreadsheet. Vendor name. Year first appearing in the budget. Business registration date. Registered agent. Managing member or owner. Any public record of prior relationship to the HOA or its officers. She worked through the evening. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of her typing and the occasional creak of the house settling. By the time she went to bed she had a folder on her laptop labeled PC and she had not yet begun. The next morning she ran 3 miles through the development in the cool, early fall light. She ran because she had always run, because 18 years of field work had embedded the habit so deeply that a day without it felt incomplete, and because running was the time when her mind processed things sideways, arriving at conclusions that direct thinking would have approached more slowly. She noticed things when she ran. She noticed the camera housings on the streetlight poles, 7 that morning, which she noted and would add to later. She noticed the drainage irregularity in the common area behind the east loop that would become a problem in a heavy rain. She noticed the 2 houses with the kind of deferred exterior maintenance that suggested residents managing money carefully. She noticed one house with a for sale sign in the window and a notice from the county tax assessor on the door. She ran past that one twice. The property record for it showed a recent sale, a family named Washington, and an assessed value that had dropped significantly from the prior year. That might be market fluctuation, which happened. Or it might be something else, which also happened. She added it to a sub-note in her folder and continued her run. She met Gerald Marsh properly on a Thursday afternoon. She had gone next door to ask about the fence line on her south property boundary, and he was on his porch in a rocking chair with a glass of iced tea and a newspaper and a look that suggested he had been expecting someone to arrive and was not entirely surprised it was her. He was 71 years old, a retired postal worker who had lived in Pinecrest Commons for 19 years. He had one of those faces that had earned its lines honestly, each one placed there by something specific, and he regarded Sandra with the careful measuring look of a man who has learned over many years to distinguish between the people who would stay and the people who would not. "You asking about the fence or asking about more than the fence?" he said. Sandra leaned against the porch railing. "Both, probably." He considered her for a moment with the slight squint of someone recalibrating. "They find you yet?" "Not yet." She paused. "What do they usually start with?" "Depends." He folded his newspaper slowly. "For people they think they can push around, they start small. Hose not coiled right. Trash cans out 1 hour past pickup time. Get you in the habit of paying, get you feeling like maybe you did something wrong, get you thinking it is easier to pay than to argue." He took a sip of his tea. "For people they are not sure about, they watch for a while first." "What kind do you think I am?" He studied her. "Hard to say yet. You fixed that broken gate latch on your second day. You read what you are handed instead of just setting it aside. You did not apologize when she told you the paint was wrong." A small, precise nod. "But you are a black woman who bought the corner lot, and that lot has been empty for 2 years because Diana Hartwell found ways to keep the last 2 offers from going through. So I guess we will find out." Sandra was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was long across the porch. A squirrel worked its way along the fence line between their yards, unhurried, purposeful, conducting its own form of survey. "Found ways how?" she said. "First family." She called their mortgage lender and reported what she described as a pattern of exterior maintenance violations that could affect property values in the development. The lender pulled the loan. He said this flatly, the way someone says a thing they have said before, to confirm rather than to astonish. Second family, she circulated a petition among homeowners claiming the prospective buyers had made verbal threats at a showing. None of it happened. The family walked away rather than spend months proving a negative. He looked out at the street. She picks her targets. Single mothers. Older residents on fixed incomes. People she has calculated cannot afford to fight her. People she thinks no one will listen to if they do. The specific cruelty of it settled in Sandra's chest the way things do when they are not surprising but are still true and still wrong. "How long?" she said. "The financial manipulation?" "Maybe 6, 7 years, that I can document." "The targeting of who gets to buy in and who gets pressure to leave?" He was quiet for a moment. "Longer." She just got more systematic about it. Better at selecting the targets and covering the tracks. "You were on the finance committee," Sandra said. It was not quite a guess. He looked at her with the first expression of genuine surprise she had seen from him. 4 years ago, he said. "How did you know?" "The way you said document," she said. "People who keep records use that word differently from people who remember things." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and went inside and came back with a shoebox. Inside were 4 years of carefully kept copies, HOA meeting minutes, budget summaries, vendor invoices he had photographed before they were filed, and a hand-drawn chart on graph paper tracking the change in quarterly fees alongside the dates when new vendors were added to the approved contractor list. Sandra looked at the chart for a long time. It was the work of a careful person operating without professional tools, the kind of work someone does when they are trying to convince themselves they are seeing what they think they are seeing. "They voted to eliminate your position," she said. "In a closed session I was not notified about." He said it without heat. The heat had long since burned off. "After I asked for backup documentation on the vendor invoices for the 3rd time. Did you contact the State Oversight Office?" "Sent a form letter about mediation. I tried to get a petition together for a special meeting. 14 signatures. Then 2 of the signatories got notices about violations at their properties within the week. People understand what that means." Sandra set the shoebox carefully on her knee. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "may I borrow this?" He handed her the whole box. She took it home and spent the weekend working through it systematically. Every document cross-referenced against the public records she had already pulled. Gerald had been meticulous but he had not had professional tools, which meant there were things he had noticed but not been able to quantify, and things he had not known to look for because he had not known what the pattern looked like from outside the individual transaction. She built a comparison table. Every vendor payment in the HOA budget summaries for the last 6 years was in the left column. The middle column was the rate paid. The right column was the market rate for the same service in comparable Virginia developments, sourced from 3 independent data points for each line item. The gap between column 2 and column 3, aggregated across all line items and all years, was the number that mattered. By Sunday evening, the picture had resolved from suspicion into something more specific. The vendor contracts all ran to entities with Hartwell in the name. The payments had increased each year. The services were real, but the pricing bore no relationship to market rates. The most recent budget showed $411,000 paid to 3 Hartwell entities for services that comparable developments were paying between $90,000 and $130,000 for. She added this to her folder and made a note to herself: conservative estimate, year 1. Then she closed the laptop and made dinner and called Maya, who was in Richmond with her father, and they talked about school and whether Maya was going to try out for the debate team this year and whether the history teacher was as good as the one from last year. Sandra did not mention the shoebox. There would be time. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday. It was printed on HOA letterhead with Diana Hartwell's name in raised print at the top, and it cited 3 violations: a ladder stored in the side yard visible from the adjacent street, a work vehicle parked in the driveway past permitted contractor hours, and the use of exterior paint in a non-approved color. Sandra read the notice 3 times. The latter citation was arguable, depending on how one interpreted visible from the adjacent street, a phrase the standards document used 4 times without ever defining it. The contractor hours citation was technically possible, though the vehicle was her own truck and she was not a contractor. The paint citation was factually wrong. She had not painted the exterior of the house. The porch ceiling primer was the color of unfinished drywall and was not observable from any street position she had tested. Total fines, $240. Due in 14 days. Failure to pay would result in a lien. She photographed the notice, the porch ceiling from the adjacent street curb line, the ladder with a tape measure, and the truck with her phone's timestamp visible. She documented everything with the discipline of someone who knows that the record you create at the beginning of a dispute is the record that matters at the end. Then she sat down and wrote a response. The response was 4 pages long. It cited the specific POA provisions under which each fine had been assessed, identified the factual inaccuracies in each citation with supporting evidence, and requested written documentation for the paint violation including date, time, and location of observation and the name of the observing party. It also noted that the phrase visible from the adjacent street was used 4 times in the standards document without definition, and requested the committee's written interpretive guidelines for that phrase. And at the end, pursuant to the relevant provisions of the POA, it formally requested complete financial records for the current and previous 6 fiscal years, including all vendor contracts, payment records, and competitive bid documentation. She sent it by certified mail, return receipt requested. The response came 11 days later and was a single paragraph upholding the fines, providing no documentation, acknowledging none of her legal citations, and directing her to contact the association's legal counsel for further inquiries. The signature was Diana Hartwell's. The total now owed, with a late fee, was $310. She added it to the folder and called Darnell Brooks. Darnell Brooks had been her partner for 4 years in the Washington field office before his transfer to Richmond. He was the best forensic accountant she had worked alongside in 18 years, which was saying something, because the financial crimes unit ran to a high standard. He had a gift for reading numerical patterns that had never entirely made sense to Sandra, who was good with numbers in the disciplined, systematic way of someone who had studied accounting, but who had nothing like Darnell's native fluency. He had told her once that looking at a fraudulent financial statement felt to him like listening to a song with one note wrong, that you heard it before you could name what you were hearing. She had found this description both completely plausible and entirely enviable. "This is a personal favor," she told him. "It always is," he said. "Secretary of State?" "Secretary of State, UCC filings, and any related entities sharing a registered agent with Hartwell Premier Properties LLC, Hartwell Property Management Incorporated, and Hartwell Home Services." A pause. "Sandy. You are a private citizen now. I am a homeowner with a reasonable belief that a fiduciary is engaged in self-dealing. The business filings are public record. I will call you tomorrow." He called the next morning. Hartwell Premier Properties had been incorporated in March of the year Diana Hartwell was first elected president, 8 years ago. The registered agent was a law firm in Northern Virginia. The managing member was Dale Hartwell, Diana's younger brother, age 46, whose last traceable employment before 2017 was as a shift supervisor at a distribution warehouse outside Fredericksburg. Hartwell Property Management and Hartwell Home Services had followed in subsequent years, the same registered agent, the same managing member. Combined, the 3 entities had received HOA payments of slightly over $400,000 in the 3 most recent fiscal years, per the public budget summaries on the HOA website. There was no competitive bid documentation in any public filing. The Common Area Infrastructure Renewal Phase 2, listed in the most recent budget at $212,000 paid to Hartwell Premier Properties, appeared, based on before and after photographs in the community Facebook group, to consist of a repainted entrance sign and 2 replacement benches. 2 benches. An entrance sign. $212,000. Sandra made a note and called Robert Walton. Robert Walton had been her ASAC for 9 years. He was 62 now, retired and living in Charlottesville with his wife Ellen, and he had, as Sandra had always known him to have, the quality of a person who can hold a great deal of information without any of it leaking around the edges. He listened to her full summary without interrupting. When she finished, he asked the same question he had always asked first. What is the exposure? Conservative, 4 to 500,000 over the full period. Likely, 6 to 700,000. Federal jurisdiction? Potentially. Community Development Block Grant, Fiscal 2021, County Administered. If there was fund commingling, HUD's Inspector General comes in. Mail fraud is almost certain given the invoicing process. You are not on the job. I know. You are a direct financial stakeholder in the outcome. I know. That is why I need your help structuring this so that nothing I develop gets challenged on conflict of interest grounds. He was quiet for a moment. Come to dinner, he said. Ellen is making enough for the neighborhood. She drove to Charlottesville on a Thursday evening and sat in the Waltons' kitchen and talked through the structure with Robert while Ellen, who had been an attorney herself before she retired, contributed periodic observations from the other side of the kitchen island that were more useful than she made them sound. Between the two of them they gave Sandra 2 names and a phone number. Claudia Reyes at the Virginia Division of Consumer Counsel, who handled Community Association fraud complaints. James Okafor, forensic accountant in Richmond, 7 HOA fraud cases in 4 years, expert testimony and 2 federal prosecutions. And the instruction that when she called Darnell Brooks again, she should tell him that Bob Walton said this one was worth the task force's time. She drove back to Pinecrest Commons with the names written in her notebook and the feeling she had felt many times at the beginning of cases that had stopped being hypothetical, the feeling she had come to think of as the shape becoming clear, when everything that had been observation and hypothesis and preliminary analysis stops being those things and becomes something with a direction. The next morning she found a handwritten note on her door. Unsigned, on notebook paper folded in half. It said, "You should know she put your name on the watch list. That means cameras. Be careful." Sandra stood in her doorway and looked at the note for a long time. She looked at the camera housing on the streetlight pole at the corner of her lot, which she had noticed on her second day and had assumed was community security infrastructure. She thought about what watch list meant in the context of a homeowners association, and what cameras meant in the context of a watch list, and she thought about the 17 camera housings she would eventually count in a systematic survey of the development, positioned in a pattern that covered not just common areas but the driveway approaches to a significant number of individual homes. She took photographs of every camera from a public right-of-way. She pulled the relevant provisions of the Virginia Consumer Protection Act regarding residential electronic surveillance. She checked whether the camera placements had been disclosed to residents and voted on by the board, which they had not, and whether that constituted an unauthorized modification to common area infrastructure, which it appeared to, and whether the footage being collected constituted an intrusion into the reasonable privacy expectations of residents conducting their normal lives at their homes, which it almost certainly did. She labeled the subfolder surveillance operations and added everything to it. Maya came home that weekend. She dropped her bag in the hall, looked at her mother, and said, "Case face." "I do not have a case face," Sandra said. "Mom. I have been watching you have that face since I was old enough to notice faces. You have it right now." Sandra made pasta and told her daughter enough. Maya listened with the specific quality of attention she had developed early, the attention of someone who had grown up watching a parent do careful, difficult work and had absorbed both the discipline and the weight of it. "She targets people she thinks will not fight back," Maya said. "Yes. And specifically people the system is less likely to listen to." "Yes." Sandra looked at her daughter. "She has been doing this for years. A retired accountant told me he looked at the financials and then just paid the fines. He said he was afraid. A woman with rotator cuff surgery paid $600 to move a mailbox that was within county guidelines because she calculated that the cost of fighting was more than she could carry." Maya was quiet for a moment. "What does she do when she is surprised? Does she back off or does she escalate?" "She escalates," Sandra said. "She has no incentive to back off. Her financial situation requires the scheme to keep running. So she escalates, which creates more documentation. Which is useful to me." "You are using her predictability against her," Maya said. "Every good investigation depends on the subject behaving consistently," Sandra said. "People who are doing something wrong have a pattern, and the pattern is what builds the case. The mistakes they think they are avoiding are rarely the ones that matter. The ones that matter are the ones they are too confident to see. What Diana did next was not subtle. 3 days after Maya went back to Richmond, a letter arrived from Whitaker and Associates informing Sandra that a formal complaint had been filed against her for harassment and intimidation of association officers, obstruction of association business operations, and conduct unbecoming a community member. The cited behaviors included Sandra's records request, her attendance and note-taking at the monthly meeting, her questions about common area expenditures, and her conversations with other residents about HOA matters. The letter further noted that pending resolution of the complaint, the association was placing an administrative hold on Sandra's access to all community amenities. Sandra read the letter with the careful attention she gave to all formal documents. Every cited behavior was explicitly protected under the HOA. Every single one. Filing a records request was a statutory right. Attending a meeting and taking notes was protected conduct. Speaking with neighbors was not subject to HOA regulation under any provision of the governing documents or any law she was aware of. The amenity hold was enforceable only for specific delinquencies enumerated in the governing documents, none of which applied to her situation. The letter was not meant to succeed. It was meant to cost time, money, attention, emotional energy. It was meant to make her feel that pushing back was going to produce an escalating series of formal confrontations that would consume more of her life than the original fines ever would. It was a tactic she had seen used against investigation targets before, the strategic deployment of process to produce exhaustion, and it worked extremely well on people who did not have the specific tools to recognize and name what was happening to them. She had those tools. She added the letter to the folder, noted that the registered agent for all 3 Hartwell entities and the attorney for the association appeared to be the same person, a detail she added to the bar inquiry thread, and called Claudia Reyes. Claudia Reyes had been a staff attorney at Consumer Counsel for 11 years and had the voice of a person who has spent a decade listening to people describe things that should not be possible and having to explain which of the things that should not be possible were nevertheless legally actionable. She listened to Sandra's summary without interruption, the same quality of listening Robert Walton had, the professional silence that was actually full of attention. "How complete is your documentation?" she asked when Sandra finished. "Complete enough to initiate a formal inquiry. I need forensic accounting validation before I can put specific numbers in front of a prosecutorial authority." "James Okafor?" Claudia said. "Walton recommended him. He did good work on 2 of my cases." A pause. "I am going to give you the same guidance I give everyone, which is that HOA fraud takes time and the subjects are usually better represented than the complainants and the procedural delays are real. What are you trying to achieve at the end? Criminal accountability for the principal. Full restitution to affected residents. Permanent governance reform." A brief silence. "That is a complete outcome. It is the appropriate outcome. Send me what you have. I will tell you where the gaps are." Sandra prepared the package over the following weekend. Chronological organization. Document authentication with source notation. Chain of custody records for Gerald Marsh's materials. 8-page executive summary. 22-page financial analysis appendix with 3 estimation models, conservative, likely, and maximum exposure. The likely figure was $680,000 over 7 years. She sent it by encrypted transfer on Sunday evening and slept for 8 hours, which was more than she had managed in 2 weeks. The harassment hearing was on a Tuesday evening. Sandra arrived 7 minutes early. Gerald Marsh was already seated in the 3rd row, which she had not arranged. She sat beside him. Trish Kaminsky was 2 rows back with a notepad, arm finally out of the sling. The Delgado couple sat across the aisle. Howard, who had been asking about the pool since June, sat in the front row. Several other residents she recognized from morning runs and sidewalk exchanges occupied the room in 1s and 2s. The room was fuller than the monthly meeting had been. Diana Hartwell sat at the board table with Paul Whitaker beside her. Whitaker was well turned out, experienced, with the composed posture of a professional who has appeared at many such proceedings and knows how they usually end. He had not, as far as Sandra could determine from her research, been involved in a federal financial crimes investigation. She wondered what he had been told about the situation he was currently in, and how much of what he had been told was accurate. The charges were read by Craig, the board member who consistently looked to Diana before answering any question. Sandra listened to each charge and confirmed, internally, that every cited behavior was legally protected. She arranged her notes and waited. When Craig finished, Diana looked at Sandra with the expectant expression of someone who has run this particular process many times and knows how the person across the table is about to respond. Sandra stood up. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use language designed to impress or intimidate. She moved through the charges provision by provision, citing the applicable POA sections from memory, noting the relevant case law for 2 provisions by citation, and addressing the factual claims underlying each charge with the specific evidence she had documented. When she reached the end of the substantive response, she added one additional observation, in the same measured tone, that the law firm currently representing the association in this proceeding was also listed as registered agent for 3 business entities that had received significant payments from the association, that this relationship had been documented and transmitted to the Virginia Division of Consumer Counsel for review, and that she had provided this information in the interest of transparency. The room was very quiet. Paul Whitaker leaned toward Diana. He spoke in a low voice for about 15 seconds. Diana's expression remained precisely composed. The quality of the composure had changed, though, the way the quality of ice changes before it moves. Craig requested a 10-minute recess. During the recess, Gerald Marsh said quietly, "You said consumer counsel in front of 40 witnesses." "I did," Sandra said. "She knows this is not about the fines. She has known for a while. Now she knows that I will say it in a room, on the record." Sandra looked at the closed door of the hallway where Whitaker and Diana had gone. "That changes what she can do next. She cannot pretend this is a misunderstanding she can manage with the right amount of administrative pressure. She has to decide how far she is willing to go. And how far do you think she will go?" Sandra thought about this carefully. She thought about the financial situation she had reconstructed from public records, the real estate project that had gone wrong in 2019, the debts that required the scheme to continue producing income, the 7 years of escalating extraction from the development that had created a dependency that was very difficult to walk away from. "As far as she thinks she needs to," she said. "But she is going to be wrong about how far that is." After the recess, the board voted to dismiss the charges. The vote was 4-0, with one abstention from a board member who had been on the board for only a year and who Sandra had assessed, based on the hearing, as someone who had not fully understood what she had joined. Diana did not look at Sandra during the vote. On the way out, the Delgados stopped her in the parking lot. The wife said they had been keeping records for a year, nothing as organized as what Sandra appeared to have, but records. She asked if they could share them. Sandra said yes. The husband said they had almost stopped coming to meetings, and Sandra said she understood, and she thought about what it costs a person to keep showing up to a room where they have been made to feel that their presence and their voice were inconveniences to be managed, and she thought about the specific discipline it took to keep doing that when the system was designed to discourage you. She got in her truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The October night was cold and clear, and the parking lot lights cast hard shadows across the asphalt. She thought about the 2 families who had not been allowed to buy the house she now owned. She thought about the specific precision of that targeting, the calculation that had identified those families as the right kind of vulnerable. She thought about what that felt like, to be told through the mechanisms of a community that you were not the kind of person who was welcome in it. She had been told versions of that in various ways throughout her life, and she had responded each time the way she had been taught to respond, which was to understand the system being used against her well enough to use it correctly herself, and to remember that the system and the person misusing it were not the same thing, and to refuse to let the person's misuse become her reason to walk away from the system. She started the truck and drove home. James Okafor arrived from Richmond on a Friday afternoon. He was 41, with the economical manner of a person who uses words and expressions the way good accountants use numbers, nothing unnecessary, everything in its right place, the meaning always more than the surface. He spent 4 hours at her kitchen table with a laptop, a second monitor, and a legal pad, and he made very little small talk, which was fine by Sandra because she had work to do during those hours as well. At 2 in the afternoon he set down his pen and looked at the legal pad. "Conservative," he said. 420,000 over 7 years. Full benefit of the doubt on labor cost variations, materials volatility, regional pricing differentials. Likely? 690. And if the pool repair contractor is related party, which I have not confirmed but the billing pattern is consistent with, you are at 740. Can you support the conservative number in a formal report? Today, with what you have, yes. For the full likely figure, I need 2 things. Bank records showing movement from the vendor accounts to a personal account in Diana Hartwell's name. And confirmation of the pool contractor relationship. Bank records require legal process, Sandra said. Or a cooperating witness with direct access to the accounts. She had been thinking about Dale Hartwell for 3 weeks. She had been careful about timing because sequence matters in investigative work, and the wrong approach at the wrong moment to the wrong person is the kind of error that cannot be corrected. She had researched him through everything available in public records. No criminal history. No prior federal interest. Tax returns filed every year, and in the years corresponding to the operation of the three entities his reported income was not consistent with being the nominal head of companies doing nearly $1 million of business annually. Either he was being paid in ways that did not appear in his filings, which would be a separate problem, or he was not being paid at all and was simply a name on forms signed because his sister had needed a name. She had dealt with nominal principals before. They came in two types. The ones who knew the full scope of what they were participating in and had made a conscious choice, usually for financial gain. And the ones who had been given a simplified version of events by someone they trusted, who had signed what they were told to sign and had not looked closely enough to understand what the signatures meant. The first type were co-conspirators. The second type were the most valuable cooperating witnesses available, because their credibility at trial derived precisely from the fact that they had not profited and had been used. She wrote Dale Hartwell a letter. It was not threatening and it was not a bluff. It laid out what she knew, what she did not know, and the likely direction of events if no one spoke to her before the formal investigative process reached conclusions that could not be reversed. It offered him the opportunity to have a conversation. It provided her contact information and a 2-week window. He called on day 9. His voice was careful and tired, the voice of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has not been sleeping well. She told me it was all set up properly, he said. That it was a normal arrangement. Businesses do it all the time. I believe you believe that, Sandra said. I did not take any of it. None of the money came to me. He said this quickly, the way people say things they need to have heard. I know. I have looked at what is available. A longer pause. How much trouble am I in? That depends on what you tell me and when, she said. And I want to be straight with you, Dale. People who cooperate early, who can demonstrate limited knowledge and no personal enrichment, have outcomes that are very different from people who cooperate late or not at all. The law is clear on that. I am not protecting her, he said. The word her held something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but was made up of both. I have not been protecting her. I have been trying to figure out what to do for 2 years and I did not know who to go to or whether it would make everything worse. I understand that, she said. Here is what you do. I am going to give you the name of an independent attorney. Not someone connected to me or to any of this. Her only job is to advise you. You call her, you tell her everything, and then you let her tell you what your options are. If you decide to cooperate, she will arrange that through the correct channels. She gave him the name. He wrote it down. What happens to her, he said. Not asking her to make promises. Just asking the way a person asks when they need to understand the shape of what is coming. If the numbers are what I believe they are, and if your information confirms what the documents suggest, this is federal territory, Sandra said. That is all I can tell you right now. A long pause. 7 years, he said, quietly. I have been signing those forms for 7 years. Get the attorney, she said. Do it this week. He did. The attorney contacted Claudia Reyes within 4 days. Claudia contacted the Virginia AG's Financial Crimes Unit the day after. The AG's office reviewed the preliminary documentation Sandra had provided months earlier combined with Dale Hartwell's statement, and contacted the HUD Office of Inspector General regarding the Community Development Block Grant. Darnell Brooks called on a Wednesday morning. His voice had the particular quality she recognized from the field, the quality of controlled information. The Financial Crimes Task Force has been assigned this case, he said. That is what I can tell you. That is what I need to know, she said. Bob Walton said this one was worth our time. He was right, she said. Sandy. A brief pause. This was solid work. I built the documentation, she said. The rest of the work is the work. She did not tell Gerald Marsh or Trish or anyone. She went for a run and came home and spent the rest of the morning on her consulting work, reviewing a financial analysis for the firm in McLean. She called Maya that evening and they talked for 40 minutes about school and the debate team and a book Maya was reading for English class that she was not sure she liked but kept thinking about. Sandra did not tell her what had happened. There would be time. She was on the ladder painting the porch ceiling, the real paint this time, a clean off-white from the approved palette, on a morning in mid-November when Diana Hartwell's Range Rover stopped at the curb. Earlier than the first visit. The November light was thin and cold and the trees were entirely bare. Sandra climbed down. Diana Hartwell walked to the edge of the driveway. She was not carrying the clipboard. Sandra took note of this in the way she took note of all absences, which was to understand that an absence is always as specific as a presence. I wonder if we could speak frankly, Diana said. I have been speaking frankly, Sandra said. A pause. The leaves from the red maple had come down and been raked and were gone, and the yard was clean and orderly in the particular way of late fall, which is not the orderliness of summer growth but the orderliness of things having finished. I think we have gotten off on the wrong foot. I think there have been misunderstandings about procedures. I do not think there were misunderstandings, Sandra said. I think the procedures were deliberate and the intentions were clear. You have contacted outside agencies based on incomplete information. I have contacted appropriate oversight authorities based on the documentation available to me, Sandra said. The public financial records, the comparative pricing analysis, the corporate registration documents for the Hartwell entities, and statements from current and former residents. None of that is incomplete. It is what the record shows. A different kind of stillness had settled over Diana Hartwell. Not the maintained composure of the hearing room or the confident management of the early meetings. The stillness of a person standing at the edge of something they cannot see the bottom of, and who has just understood, fully and without remaining room for denial, that the ground they have been standing on is not as solid as they believed. What exactly is it that you are trying to accomplish? Diana said. I have been clear about this from the beginning, Sandra said. Accurate financial accounting. Full disclosure to the residents whose funds were affected. Restitution where applicable. And governance structures that make this kind of scheme impossible to run again. You are going to destroy this community, Diana said. I am going to make it what it was supposed to be, Sandra said. And the community was not destroyed by the investigation. It was damaged by the people who ran it this way. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Diana stared at her for a long moment, the look of someone doing a final accounting, finding the numbers not where she expected them to be. The thing you have been doing here, Sandra said, the targeting, the fines, the surveillance, the blocking families from buying in, that is not administration. That is not community management. That is the use of institutional power to harm specific people for specific reasons, some financial and some not. And I want you to know that I know that, and that the people conducting the formal investigation know that, and that it is documented. She held Diana Hartwell's eyes for a moment. She did not say it with anger. She said it the way she said things she needed to have understood, clearly and completely, without the distortion of emotion. Diana turned and walked back to her car. The Range Rover pulled away faster than it usually did. Sandra went back up the ladder and finished painting the ceiling. The federal search warrant was executed on a Monday morning in late November. Gerald Marsh texted at 7:49, 2 black SUVs at Hartwell's house. 3 more at the clubhouse. Sandra sat in her kitchen with her coffee. She thought about 7 years and 2 benches and $680,000. She thought about Gerald Marsh keeping records in a shoebox for 4 years while waiting for someone who could use them. She thought about Trish Kaminsky and the mailbox fine and the calculation of whether to fight or pay when you have 2 children and a surgery recovery and a job at the school district. She thought about Howard and the pool and the expression he had when he talked about expecting things. She thought about the Washington family and the peeling tax notice, which she had eventually traced to a complaint that had been filed with the county tax assessor by the HOA regarding alleged property use violations, a complaint that appeared to have been submitted after the family had asked publicly about attending a board meeting. She thought about the 2 families who had tried to buy the corner lot. She thought about what it meant to be told, through the mechanisms of the community itself, that you were not the kind of person who was welcome in it, and about the particular, specific injury of that, the way it was designed to look like policy while being something else entirely. Darnell Brooks called at 11. An arrest has been made, he said. The indictment is being unsealed this afternoon. That is all I can tell you. That is enough, she said. The indictment listed 9 counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement from an organization receiving federal funds, money laundering, and 5 counts of filing false financial instruments. The total amount was $712,000 over 7 years. Dale Hartwell was named as an unindicted cooperating co-conspirator with an executed cooperation agreement. Paul Whitaker had been referred to the Virginia State Bar for a disciplinary inquiry. The referral noted his dual role as association counsel and registered agent for the shell companies receiving association payments. The remaining board members met an emergency session that evening. Craig, who had always looked to Diana before speaking, spoke first and without waiting. He moved to censure the former president, refer all financial records to the federal investigation, terminate the current legal retainer, and engage new independent counsel. The motion passed without dissent. Gerald Marsh attended. He texted Sandra afterward, 4 seats vacant. Are you interested? She thought about it. She thought about what the answer cost and what it was worth and what it meant to have the skills she had and to be present in a community that needed them used. She thought about the structures Gerald had talked about, the ones that made things impossible to rebuild once they were gone, and she thought about who built those structures and how. She texted back, "Send me the forms." The November meeting had 91 residents. Largest in the development's history. Sandra ran for one of the 4 vacant board seats. Trish Kaminsky ran for another. Gerald Marsh ran for Finance Committee Chair. The Delgados nominated Ann Weatherspoon, a retired schoolteacher who lived in the West Loop and who had been keeping her own notes on fee irregularities for 2 years and had not known what to do with them. All for one. The audit took 3 months. James Okafor presented it at a February community meeting where people stood along the walls. Confirmed misappropriation, $741,000. 73 residents assessed improper fines over 7 years. Combined total, $88,000. The board voted unanimously to reimburse all 73 in full, to be funded from the reserve account and recovered through the restitution proceedings. Gerald Marsh stood up at the February meeting and said something that was not on the agenda. He said he had lived in the development for 19 years, and for 7 of those years he had been watching something he could not stop alone. He said that what the last year had taught him was that stopping something like this required several different things to be present at the same time: someone with the professional knowledge to know what they were looking at, people who had kept records even when they were not sure the records would matter, neighbors who had been willing to say something in a room even when speaking had felt pointless, and the simple act of one person telling another that they were not alone and meaning it. He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "And then you have to build structures so that it cannot happen again. Because the person is only part of the problem. The other part is the absence of anything that would have stopped her sooner." The governance framework the board passed in March was 15 pages long. Competitive bidding required for all contracts over $5,000. Annual independent audits, auditor selected by resident vote. Mandatory public disclosure of any financial relationship between any board member and any association vendor, with recusal from related votes. Meeting minutes, including executive session summaries, available to residents within 30 days. A resident oversight committee with real access to financial records and the authority to request documentation from the board. Sandra had drafted it over 3 weekends in January, drawing on the POA, the Community Associations Institute governance standards, and everything she had come to understand about how institutions fail when accountability is removed, and how they can be rebuilt when accountability is made structural rather than dependent on the character of whoever happens to be in charge. She presented it at the March meeting. Before the vote she spoke briefly. She said that rules matter. Not because following rules is always right, but because rules, when they are built to protect people rather than protect power, are what makes shared life possible. She said that what had happened in Pinecrest Commons had happened because someone took structures that existed to protect the community and used them to extract from it, and that the answer to that was not to distrust all structures. The answer was to build them better, with more transparency, more accountability, and more participation from the people the structures were supposed to serve. She said that every person in the room had the legal right to access the financial records of their association. That right existed before she moved in. It existed while the fraud was running. What was missing was not the rights but the knowledge that the rights existed, and the belief that using them would actually work. She said, "That is the only lesson here. Know your rights. Use them. Help your neighbors know theirs. Because the rights are only as strong as the number of people who know about them and are willing to stand on them." She said it without drama, the way she said things she believed. Maya was in the 3rd row. She had driven up from Richmond on Saturday morning without telling Sandra she was coming. She was sitting beside Trish Kaminsky's daughter Becca, who was 12 and had been told enough of the story to want to be in the room. Sandra caught Maya's eye across the room. Maya gave her a small, specific nod. The framework passed. The abstention came from a board member who wanted to review 2 provisions more carefully. She reviewed them and supported the final version the following month. The fence got painted in April. Sandra chose an off-white from the approved palette, the color she had liked from the beginning, and that was, as it turned out, entirely consistent with every standard the development had ever officially maintained. She did it on a Saturday morning. Ladder in the side yard. Roller in hand. The spring light coming down through new leaves. Gerald Marsh brought 2 cups of coffee and sat on the porch steps. They talked about the season and the trees and the pool, which would reopen in June with a real contractor and real oversight and a board member present at every scheduled inspection. They talked about Howard, who had cried at the February meeting. He had told Sandra, after the meeting, that he had been planning to sell the house. That he had been so tired. That he had not believed things could change. She had told him, they changed because people did not stop. He had said, they changed because you came. She had wanted to explain that this was not quite right, that one person alone could not have done it, that it required Gerald's shoebox and Trish's willingness to talk and Dale Hartwell finally making the call and Claudia Reyes and Darnell Brooks and Robert and Ellen Walton's kitchen table and the 47 signatures on the special meeting petition and every resident who had kept records even when they were not sure who would ever read them. She had wanted to say all of that, and she had looked at Howard's face and understood what he actually needed to hear, which was not a full accounting of the causal structure but a simpler, truer thing. She had said, I came, and I stayed, and I used what I know. That is all any of us can do. He had nodded. She put the last stroke on the fence and stepped back and looked at it. Clean and right in the April light, a mockingbird in the red maple at the corner of her lot was conducting its complicated argument with the morning, the way mockingbirds do, assembling every song it had ever heard into something that belonged entirely to itself. Maya's car pulled into the driveway. Maya got out and looked at the fence and said, "That looks good." "It does," Sandra agreed. They stood beside each other for a moment looking at it. "Becca wants to help," Maya said. "With the oversight committee or whatever the next thing is. Her mom is on it, but she wants to do something too." "She is 12, Sandra said. "I was 12 when I started reading your case files," Maya said. Sandra looked at her daughter. "That was not sanctioned." "No," Maya said. "But it was educational." Sandra carried the paint tray to the garage. "Tell Becca there is a youth advisory committee proposal on the agenda for next year. She can read the proposal, come to the meeting, and make the case for it herself in front of the board." "She will do that," Maya said. "She is kind of like you." "What does that mean?" "Organized. Persistent. Not afraid of the clipboard people." Sandra washed her hands at the spigot. She thought about that description for a moment. Organized, persistent, not afraid of the clipboard people. She thought about Becca at 12, sitting in the back row of a community meeting and paying attention instead of looking at her phone. She thought about what it meant for a kid to see adults use the processes available to them and decide that was worth learning rather than ignoring. That was something real. Inside, she opened her laptop. The folder labeled PC still existed, but the subfolders had changed. Audit complete. Governance reform passed. Restitution in process. Documentation archive. And one new folder, created in late March, after the third call in a month from a resident in a different county who had found her name through the Consumer Counsel office and asked if she could explain what their rights were. That folder was labeled, Next. She opened it and started reading. The case was different from Pinecrest Commons in its specifics. Different state provisions, different financial structure, different kind of misuse. But the underlying shape was familiar, the way all cases of this kind had a familiar shape once you understood the shape, someone with institutional authority using that authority against the people it existed to protect, in a way calibrated to make the cost of fighting higher than most people believed they could pay. The key word was believed. Because the cost was often not as high as it appeared. It only appeared that way because the person running the scheme needed it to appear that way, needed the target to look at the calculation and reach the conclusion that compliance was cheaper than resistance. The whole thing depended on isolation and on the belief that fighting was impossible or pointless. It depended on each person making the calculation alone. Sandra had been making notes for 20 minutes when her phone buzzed. It was Gerald Marsh. The text said, 2 more families in the development told me today they finally got the refund checks. $6,300 between them. They wanted me to tell you, thank you. She read the message. She thought about Trish's mailbox and Gerald's shoebox and Howard's pool and the Washington family and the corner lot that had been empty for 2 years. She thought about all the small calculations that had been made in that development over 7 years, each person alone, each one deciding that the cost of fighting was more than they could bear, not knowing that the person next door had made the same calculation and the person across the street had made the same one, all of them in their separate rooms adding up the same wrong numbers. She typed back, tell them they did the hard part. I just knew where to look. She set the phone down and went back to the file. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. But she had the skills, and she had learned over the course of the last year, more fully than she had understood before, that having the skills and being willing to use them was not a small thing. It was not heroism and it was not unusual and it was not beyond what an ordinary person with the right knowledge could do. The knowledge was the key, not the person. The knowledge was acquirable. The rights were available. The structures existed. What was needed was someone who would use them correctly and stay until the work was finished. She had stayed. She would stay again. That was the thing she had come to understand about herself, the core of it, the thing beneath the career and the skills in the 18 years, she was not built for looking away. Not because it cost her nothing to engage but because the cost of not engaging was higher, in ways that could not be measured in time or money but could be measured in the specific gravity of having seen something wrong and chosen not to act. The mockingbird in the maple kept singing, assembling its borrowed music into something entirely its own. Sandra Reeves read the new file and made her first notes in the margin and started, as she always started, by writing down what she did not yet know, because that was where the work was, and the work was where she lived. The second month in Pinecrest Commons was harder than the first in a specific way that Sandra had not fully anticipated, which was the way in which the ordinary routines of daily life continued alongside everything else. She still had her consulting work, which required 8 to 10 focused hours a week and which she had organized into the early morning hours before the development fully woke up. She still ran 3 miles every morning. She still went to the grocery store and cooked dinner and called her mother in Durham on Sunday evenings. She still had a house that needed work, the kitchen refinishing and the back porch railing and the upstairs bathroom tile that had cracked in the winter of 2021 and been inadequately repaired, all of it waiting with the patient indifference of inanimate objects. The house did not care about Diana Hartwell. The kitchen floor did not know that Sandra was building a financial crimes case in the evenings after her consulting work was done. The cracked tile in the bathroom was entirely unaware of the legal significance of vendor contract documentation. This was, she found, useful. The work on the house was a form of grounding, the way any physical work is grounding when the rest of your attention is in the abstract territory of numbers and patterns and the slow, careful construction of a record that would have to be completely defensible at every stage. She refinished the kitchen floor in the second week of October, which required moving the kitchen table into the living room and working in sections over 3 days. It was straightforward work with a clear outcome, which was the kind of work she found restorative when the other work was not straightforward and the outcome was not yet clear. Gerald Marsh came over while she was working on the second section and stood in the doorway and watched for a while. "You do this kind of work yourself," he said. "When I can," she said. "I like knowing how things work." He was quiet for a moment. Diana sent a notice last year to a resident who was doing her own porch repairs. Cited her for conducting unlicensed contractor work on the property. Sandra looked up from the sanding. Was it her own property? Her own house. She was sanding her own porch railing. The notice was baseless, Sandra said. The HOA has no authority to regulate how a homeowner maintains their own property, as long as the work meets code and is permitted where required. She paid the fine, Gerald said. Because she did not know that, Sandra said. He was quiet for another moment. "How do you know all of this?" "I looked it up," Sandra said. "That is what you do when you need to know something. You look it up. The Virginia Property Owners Association Act is available online. It is not easy reading, but it is not impossible reading either. Most people do not know their rights because they have never had a reason to learn them, and then when they need them, they do not know where to start. And you think most people could learn them if they needed to? I think most people could learn the parts that apply to their situation, yes," she said. "Not all of it. But enough to know when they are being told something that is not true, and enough to know who to call when that happens." He thought about this. "That is a fairly optimistic view." "It is a practical view," she said. "I am not optimistic by nature. I am practical. The practical reality is that most people are more capable of defending themselves than they have been made to believe. The people who run schemes like this one depend on that gap between what people can do and what they believe they can do. It is the most important gap in the whole structure." He nodded slowly. He stayed for another 20 minutes, not saying much, watching the floor take shape, and then went home for dinner. Sandra finished the second section and cleaned the equipment and stood at the window of the living room looking at the darkening street. The development was going quiet in the particular way of suburban evenings in early fall, the lights coming on in windows, the sound of cars in driveways, the small sounds of hundreds of private lives being lived at close range. She had lived in apartments and in government housing near field offices and in one house in Maryland with her ex-husband that had been fine for the years it was fine. She had not lived, as a grown adult on her own terms, in a place that was simply hers. She liked it. Even with Diana Hartwell and the clipboard and the fines and the shoebox and everything that needed to be done. She liked the house and the corner lot and the red maple and the mockingbird. She liked knowing her neighbors by name. She liked the particular quality of light on the porch ceiling in the morning, which she had now looked at many times from the ladder and which she found, depending on the weather, either useful or beautiful. She had not expected to feel this way about a corner lot in a Virginia HOA development. Life had a habit of producing the unexpected in the places you had already decided you understood. She went back to the kitchen and made dinner. The third time Diana Hartwell appeared uninvited at Sandra's property, it was a Sunday morning in late October, and Sandra was in the side yard pulling up the last of the summer garden beds that had been left by the previous owners in a state of extreme neglect. She was wearing work gloves and her oldest jeans and she had dirt up to her wrists when she heard the creak of the side gate. She turned around. Diana was standing inside the gate, clipboard in hand, wearing the pale gray blazer and a look of studied concern. "I knocked on the front door," Diana said. There was no answer. "I did not hear you," Sandra said. "I was in the yard. I wanted to check on a complaint we received about possible unauthorized vegetation removal in the common buffer zone adjacent to your property." Sandra straightened up and looked at the garden beds. They were clearly within her property line. They were clearly the kind of overgrown annual beds that had been abandoned for 2 or 3 seasons, full of dead tomato stakes and invasive morning glory vines and the collapsed remains of something that might have been a raised bed frame at one point. These beds are on my property, Sandra said. The survey pins are there. She pointed to the survey pin at the corner of her lot, visible from where they were standing. The buffer zone begins on the other side of that pin. Diana looked at the survey pin and then at her clipboard. We have received a complaint from a neighbor that the work may be encroaching. Which neighbor? Diana's eyes stayed on the clipboard. Complaint information is confidential under our privacy policy. The privacy policy is in the community standards packet, Sandra said. Section 11. I read it. The section covers the names of residents filing complaints. It does not create confidentiality around the subject matter of the complaint. You can tell me which property the encroachment is alleged to be affecting. Diana looked at her for a moment. The clipboard hand was still. I would also note, Sandra said, that you entered my private side yard through a gate that was closed, which constitutes an entry onto private property without permission. That is not authorized under any provision of the governing documents or under Virginia law for a purpose that is not an emergency. I would like you to leave the yard. Something moved across Diana Hartwell's face that was very close to what Sandra had been watching for. Not quite alarm. The precursor to alarm, the recognition that the framework being relied on was not holding the weight being put on it. I was conducting a community standards inspection, Diana said. Community standards inspections require notice to the resident under Section 7 of the standards document, Sandra said. You provided no notice. Please leave the yard. Diana left the yard. She walked back through the gate without a word, and Sandra listened to her footsteps on the front path and then the sound of the Range Rover starting and pulling away from the curb. Sandra wrote down the time, the circumstances, and the exact words of the exchange in her notebook within 10 minutes of Diana's departure. She also photographed the gate, the survey pin, and the garden beds from multiple angles. She added this to the surveillance operations subfolder and made a note, warrantless entry to private property. Date and time documented. Photographic evidence. Potential trespass and privacy violation. She went back to the garden beds and finished the work. The week before the harassment hearing, Sandra received a visit from a resident she had not yet met. The man knocked on her front door on a Wednesday evening and introduced himself as Marcus Ellis, the retired accountant whom Trish Kaminsky had mentioned. He was 64 years old, methodical in the way that accountants often are, with a quality of precision in his speech that suggested someone who had spent a career being careful about what he said and what he signed. He was not there to talk about his own situation. He had heard from Trish that Sandra had some kind of background in financial matters, and he had spent 2 nights going back through the HOA budget summaries on his own, and he had a question. The question was about depreciation. He had noticed that the depreciation schedule for common area assets listed several items as fully depreciated and scheduled for replacement, items that had subsequently been the subject of replacement contracts awarded to the Hartwell entities. What he wanted to know was whether the depreciation schedule matched the actual condition of the assets, because from what he had observed, several of the replaced items had not appeared to need replacement. Sandra made him tea and they sat at the kitchen table and she asked him to walk her through what he had found. He walked her through it carefully, with the organization of someone who had been an accountant for 30 years. The pool filtration system had been listed as fully depreciated and replaced 2 years ago for $87,000. He had photographs, taken over the years, showing the pool equipment in good working order. The parking lot resurfacing in the North Loop had been listed as necessary due to structural deterioration and contracted for $61,000. He had photographs showing the surface in normal condition for a parking lot of that age, not requiring full replacement. Sandra looked at his photographs. She looked at the contract line items. She looked at the depreciation schedule. Did you keep all of this? She said. I keep everything, he said. I have kept everything since I first looked at the budget 3 years ago and the numbers did not make sense to me. Why did you not file a complaint then? He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid, he said. He said it straightforwardly, without apology, the way a person says something true that they have accepted and stopped being ashamed of. My wife had just been diagnosed with something that required expensive treatment. I thought about what would happen if Diana found a reason to make our lives difficult during that period. I thought about the lien process and the legal fees and the time it would take. I decided to just keep records and wait. Wait for what? For someone who could actually do something with them, he said. He looked at her directly. Trish said you were that person. Sandra was quiet for a moment. She thought about what he had just described, 3 years of keeping records and carrying the weight of what he knew and the calculation he had made about when it was safe to act. She thought about how many other people in the development had made similar calculations, had seen something wrong and decided to wait and watch and keep records, all of them waiting for someone else to move first. Can I add your documentation to mine? She said. It is why I came, he said. After he left, she sat with the new materials for an hour. Marcus's depreciation analysis added another layer of precision to the financial picture that James Okafor would find useful. The pool filtration documentation alone was potentially worth $30,000 to $40,000 in the adjusted misappropriation estimate. She added his folder to her files and labeled it Ellis Contribution and noted the date in the context of his arrival. The following day she added a note to the executive summary she had prepared for Claudia Reyes. Additional resident documentation received, depreciation fraud element confirmed by independent photographic record. Recommend revised financial model before formal inquiry determination. She sent the update by encrypted transfer. On the Sunday before the hearing, Gerald Marsh organized what he described as a neighborhood walk, which he had done occasionally over the years as a way to check in with residents he did not see regularly. He invited Sandra, and Sandra came, and they spent 2 hours walking the development's paths with a loose group of 8 residents, talking about the fall in the trees and the pool in the upcoming hearing. The conversation was not about strategy. It was the kind of conversation that builds trust between people who do not fully know each other yet, the conversation of neighbors who are beginning to understand that they are more connected than they have been living. Trish walked beside Sandra for part of it. She said, without prompting, that she had told her daughter Becca what was happening, in broad terms appropriate for a 12-year-old, because Becca had asked why her mother had been so worried for so long and Trish had decided she was old enough to understand. She said Becca had asked what she could do to help. Trish had not known what to say. What did you tell her? Sandra asked. I told her to pay attention, Trish said. To meetings. To the rules. To who is in charge of things and whether the way they are being run makes sense. She paused. Is that the right thing to say? It is exactly the right thing to say, Sandra said. Paying attention is where everything starts. Howard joined the walk for the last 30 minutes. He was 70 years old, a retired electrician, and he had the particular mix of bitterness and humor that belongs to people who have been disappointed enough times to have developed a philosophy about it. He told Sandra, on the walk, that he had voted in every HOA election for 18 years and had never once been on the winning side, and that 3 years ago he had stopped trying because trying felt like walking into a room where the furniture was bolted to the floor and being told to rearrange it. Sandra walked beside him for a while without saying anything. Then she said, the furniture was bolted to the floor. You were not imagining that. He looked at her. The elections were being run in a way that made opposition structurally difficult, she said. That is a documented pattern in the records. You were not wrong. You were dealing with a real obstacle. The question was never whether you were imagining it, but whether the obstacle was permanent. And was it? No, she said. It was dependent on enough people believing it was. Which is the only reason it lasted as long as it did. He walked beside her in silence for a while. When they reached the pool entrance, which had its usual closed sign and chain, he stopped and looked at it for a long time. June? He said. June, she said. He nodded. He kept walking. The weeks between the hearing and the federal search warrant were the most difficult in a specific way that Sandra had anticipated but had not been able to fully prepare for, which was the waiting. She had set the mechanisms in motion. She had provided the documentation. She had made the connections and initiated the formal processes. Now those processes had to run, and running processes take time, and the time was not hers to control. She worked on the house. She walked the development. She attended the monthly meeting in November, sitting in the back row and taking notes and watching the 4 remaining board members try to run a meeting without the person who had been running all of them for 8 years. It was, in its way, informative. 2 of the board members seemed genuinely uncertain how to proceed without Diana's guidance, which told Sandra something about how the board had actually functioned. One board member, a woman named Patricia, seemed relieved in a way she was trying to keep off her face and was not entirely succeeding. And Craig, who had always looked to Diana before speaking, seemed to be making a visible effort to speak from his own position for the first time, which was simultaneously awkward and quietly encouraging. She did not make herself conspicuous at the November meeting. She did not ask questions. She took notes and went home. On the Saturday before the search warrant was executed, she had a long phone conversation with Robert Walton. They did not talk about the case. Ellen had been diagnosed with a cardiac issue that was serious enough to require attention, and Robert was in the mode of someone reorganizing his priorities, calmly and without drama, in the way that calm, undramatic people reorganize priorities when something important requires it. They talked about Ellen and about Charlottesville in the fall and about his daughter who had just had her first child, and at the end of the conversation Robert said, "You are doing good work, Sandra." "The process is doing its work," she said. "The process needed someone to start it," he said. "And someone to keep it on track. That is not nothing." "It is not the whole thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is the part without which the rest does not happen." She thought about this after the call ended, sitting in the kitchen in the late afternoon, the November light going orange outside the window. She thought about what it meant to be the person who starts something, and what it means to give that too much weight or too little. The truth was somewhere between the extremes, as it usually was. One person with the right knowledge and the willingness to use it and the patience to stay was necessary but not sufficient. It required the community to be ready to act on what was uncovered. It required the institutions to function when given complete and correct information. It required the legal and regulatory frameworks to be what they were supposed to be, which in this case they were, more or less, when correctly applied. None of it was guaranteed. None of it was automatic. All of it required specific choices by specific people at specific moments, and any one of those choices being made differently could have changed the outcome. That was not a comforting thought, exactly, but it was an honest one, and Sandra had always found honest thoughts more useful than comforting ones. She made dinner and watched the light change outside the window and thought about what she had learned in the last 3 months. She had learned, or relearned, that the gap between what institutions are supposed to do and what they actually do depends enormously on whether the people using them know how to use them. She had learned that most residents in most communities are more capable of defending their rights than they have been made to believe, and that the belief is the obstacle more than the capability. She had learned that collective action does not require a central organizer, it requires enough people to stop calculating their isolation correctly and start calculating their solidarity instead. And she had learned something about herself, which was that the work she had done for 18 years in the Bureau had not been an expression of an institutional identity that she had now left behind. It had been an expression of something more specific and more durable than that, a way of engaging with the world that was fundamentally hers, and that was not diminished by the fact that she no longer carried a badge. The badge had been a tool. The work was the thing. In the weeks after the arrest, while the formal legal processes moved forward with their own deliberate speed, Sandra noticed something happening in the development that she had not fully planned for and that moved her in ways she found difficult to name precisely. People began to talk to each other differently. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a movie where the neighborhood gathers in someone's backyard and embraces in relief. More quietly than that. The way Trish and the woman from Unit 41, who had been neighbors for 3 years and had never spoken beyond hello, began walking to the mailboxes at the same time in the morning, talking. The way Howard and Marcus Ellis ended up at the same bench near the closed pool on a Tuesday afternoon, comparing notes on their respective fence situations, and from the bench went to Howard's house for coffee, and from the coffee came a plan to submit a joint request to the new board for clarification on the fence maintenance policy. The way people started coming to meetings. The November meeting had 91 people. The December meeting, even with the holiday season and the disruption of the board transition, had 78. The January meeting, with 4 new board members and a formal presentation from James Okafor on the preliminary audit findings, had over 100. Gerald Marsh told Sandra after the January meeting that in 19 years in the development he had never seen 100 people at a meeting. She said that was because people had never had a reason to believe the meeting was worth attending. He said yes, that was it exactly, and he said it with the expression of someone who is finally seeing something in its correct shape after a long time of looking at it wrong. The Washington family came back to 2 meetings in the spring. They did not live in the development anymore, they had moved on after the tax situation. But they came to the meetings because they had heard about what had happened and they wanted to understand what had happened to them, and at the second meeting one of them, a woman named Keisha Washington, stood up and told the room a version of events that the room had not known about, the complaint filed with the tax assessor after they asked about attending a board meeting, the subsequent pressure that had made the cost of staying feel higher than the cost of leaving. The room was quiet while she spoke. When she sat down, Gerald Marsh thanked her for coming. Sandra, from her board seat, said that the board had documented the complaint and included it in the materials provided to the federal investigators and that it would be part of the formal proceedings. Keisha Washington looked at Sandra for a moment and said, "I did not know there was anyone keeping track." "There was not," Sandra said. "And then there was. That is the lesson, I think. That it is never too late to start keeping track, and it is never too early either." After the meeting, Trish's daughter Becca cornered Sandra in the parking lot with the direct confidence of a 12-year-old who has decided she wants to know something. She said, "My mom said you used to work for the FBI." "I did," Sandra said. "Do you miss it?" Sandra thought about this. She thought about the Washington field office and the years of case files and the specific satisfaction of building a record that held up under every challenge. She thought about the meeting with the deputy director and the resignation and the consulting work in the corner lot house. "I miss some of it," she said. "I do not miss being told which work was worth doing, Becca considered this with the serious expression of someone who is genuinely working through an idea. But you do the same work now, she said. Without the FBI. Yes, Sandra said. So you just needed the FBI until you learned how to do it without them. Sandra looked at Becca for a moment. 12 years old, in the parking lot of a homeowners association community meeting, arriving at a conclusion that had taken Sandra considerably longer to reach. Something like that, she said. Becca nodded, satisfied, and went to find her mother. Sandra stood in the parking lot for another minute. The April night was cool and the parking lot lights made the pavement shine the same way they had the night of the harassment hearing, 6 months earlier, when she had sat in her truck in this same lot and thought about the specific arithmetic of who gets to fight and who cannot afford to. She thought about that arithmetic again, and about how it had shifted in this particular community over the course of 6 months, not because the law had changed or the rights had changed, but because enough people had come to understand that the rights existed and could be used. That was the thing, she thought. The thing beneath all the legal citations and the forensic accounting and the certified mail and the Consumer Counsel referral and the task force and the indictment. The thing that made all of it possible was not the law itself but people's knowledge of the law and belief in their own capacity to use it. The law had been there the whole time Diana Hartwell was running her scheme. The rights had been there. The POA had been there. What had been missing was the belief that the law applied to people like Gerald Marsh and Trish Kaminsky and Howard and the Delgados and the families who had tried to buy the corner lot, the belief that the structures existed for them and not only against them. That belief was what changed. And the belief changed because enough people stopped being alone with it. She got in her truck and drove home. In the folder labeled Next, there were now 4 subfolders. 4 different developments in 4 different counties, each one described in a preliminary email or a phone call from a resident who had heard her name through some chain of connection and needed to understand what their options were. The situations were all different in their particulars and similar in their shape: an HOA board operating without transparency, money moving in ways that did not add up, residents who had been paying fines they did not know they could challenge, people who had been waiting for someone to tell them they were not alone. She had not gone looking for these cases. She had not advertised or set up a website or called anyone. She had done one thing carefully and correctly, and the network of people who needed what she knew had found her the way people find what they need, by paying attention and asking the right questions of the right people at the right time. She read through the 4 preliminary files carefully and made notes on each one. She could not take all 4 herself. The consulting work was still there and the house was still there, and Maya came home most weekends during the school year, and those weekends mattered and would not be traded for case files. She needed to be realistic about what she could carry. But she knew people. She knew Claudia Reyes and James Okafor and Robert Walton and Darnell Brooks and a dozen other former colleagues and associated professionals who had the relevant skills in the relevant areas. She knew how to look at a situation and identify which part of the skill set it needed and who had that skill set, and how to connect the person with the situation in a way that was useful. She spent 2 evenings writing detailed preliminary assessments of each of the 4 cases, based on the public records she could access in 3 hours of research per case, identifying the strongest documentary evidence, the most likely legal framework, the appropriate state or federal oversight body to contact, and the most critical first steps for the resident to take on their own before professional assistance was available. She sent each assessment to the resident who had called, with a cover note explaining what the assessment contained and what it did not contain, and recommending, for 2 of the 4 cases, specific attorneys or advocacy organizations she trusted. For the 3rd case, which had characteristics suggesting possible federal jurisdiction, she forwarded to Robert Walton with her analysis and his suggestion to call Darnell Brooks. The 4th case she kept for herself. It was in a development 2 counties away, a situation involving a management company that appeared to be operating the same way Diana Hartwell had operated, with the same basic structure of related party contracts and inflated pricing and systematic targeting of specific residents. The resident who had called her was a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Weston, 68 years old, who had been keeping records for 5 years and who described herself, in the initial call, as someone who had been praying for someone to call. Sandra looked at Dorothy Weston's preliminary summary and her own notes and thought about Gerald Marsh and the shoebox and 4 years of records and someone finally showing up who could read them. She called Dorothy Weston on a Thursday evening. They talked for an hour. Dorothy had good records and a clear memory and the particular clarity of a retired schoolteacher about what was and was not accurate, which was an extremely useful quality in a potential cooperating witness. At the end of the call, Dorothy said, "I've been hoping someone would help for a long time." "You helped yourself," Sandra said. 5 years of records. That is the work. Everything else is knowing what to do with the work. "You know what to do," Dorothy said. "Yes," Sandra said, "and I am going to teach you what I know." She opened a new document and started writing. Not a case file and not a legal brief, but something closer to what she had said at the March meeting, a plain language guide to the rights available to a homeowner in a Virginia HOA community, the specific provisions of the POA that most people did not know about, the documents that could be requested and how to request them correctly, the oversight bodies that existed and what triggers their involvement, the sequence of steps that moved a concern from frustration to formal record to official review. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote everything, and she wrote it for the person who had never worked in federal law enforcement and had not studied accounting and was simply a resident trying to understand what their rights actually were. She wrote it in language that did not require a legal background to parse. She added references and citations for every claim so that anyone could verify what they were reading against the original sources. It took 3 evenings and was 12 pages long. She sent it to Dorothy Weston. She sent it to Gerald Marsh. She asked Gerald to share it with anyone in the development who wanted it. 2 weeks later she found out that Gerald had printed 60 copies and distributed them at the December meeting, and that a version of it had been shared in the community Facebook group and downloaded over 200 times. Sandra thought about this for a while. 200 downloads of a 12-page guide to HOA residents' rights, in one development, in 1 month. She thought about how many developments there were in Virginia, and how many residents in those developments were in situations similar to the ones she had seen, and about the gap between what those residents knew about their rights and what they needed to know. She thought about what it would take to close that gap. Not all at once, not by one person, but incrementally, the way any large thing changes, through the accumulation of small things done correctly by a large number of people over a long period of time. She did not have a name for what she was starting. She was not sure it needed one yet. It was enough to do the next thing correctly and let the shape of it emerge from the doing. She opened a browser tab and looked up the Virginia HOA education requirements and the Community Associations Institute Resident Rights Program and the legal aid organizations that serve low-income homeowners in Virginia, and she started taking notes. The mockingbird in the red maple was not yet back. It was still February, and the red maple was still bare, and the mornings were cold in the way of February mornings in Virginia, which is to say seriously cold, cold that means business, the kind of cold that the trees and the birds and the ground all understand as a thing to be endured until it is over. Sandra ran her 3 miles in the cold and came home and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table that she had refinished in October, the one that had been rough and uneven when she moved in and that was now smooth and right and catching the winter light in a way that pleased her every morning. She thought about the year. She thought about the ladder and the primer and the clipboard and the Range Rover and Gerald's shoebox. She thought about what she had come to Pinecrest Commons to find, which was a quiet place that was hers, and what she had found instead, which was something more complicated and more worth having. She thought about Dorothy Weston and the 4 subfolders in the next folder and the 12-page guide and the 200 downloads and the things she had not started yet and the things that needed starting. She thought about Maya, who would be home for the weekend on Friday, and who had a debate tournament coming up and had started reading case law for fun, which Sandra found simultaneously concerning and exactly right. She drank her coffee. She opened her laptop. She looked at the next folder. She started working. The spring came in the way Virginia springs always did, not gradually but in a rush, the way the whole season had been waiting behind a door and someone finally opened it. The red maple came back green and the mockingbird returned and took up residence in the upper branches with the proprietary confidence of a tenant who had been away for the winter but had never stopped considering the tree theirs. Sandra heard it on a Tuesday morning in late March while she was drinking coffee on the porch, the first morning warm enough to do that without a coat. She recognized the sound before she fully registered that she was hearing it, the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in months. She sat with her coffee and listened to the bird assemble its borrowed music into something entirely its own, and she thought about the year. She had moved into the house on a September morning with a plan and a plausible assumption that the plan was the hardest part. She had been wrong about that in the specific way that people are wrong when they have planned correctly for everything they could anticipate and underestimated what they could not. Diana Hartwell had been unanticipatable in her particulars, though not in her type, and the work of the last 7 months had required things that had not been in the plan, the shoebox and the late-night phone calls and the harassment hearing and the careful, patient accumulation of a record that held together at every point of pressure. She did not regret any of it. That was the true and simple answer to the question she asked herself sometimes on the porch with coffee, the question about whether the year had been what she had wanted or something else. It had been something else. It had also been exactly what she was built for, and she had come to understand that those two things were not in conflict. Dorothy Weston drove up to Pinecrest Commons on a Saturday in early April with a folder of documents and a focused, quiet manner that reminded Sandra of the best witnesses she had ever worked with, the ones who knew what they knew and said it clearly without embellishment. They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and Sandra walked her through the preliminary analysis and the documentation strategy and the sequence of requests that needed to go out first, and at the end Dorothy said she felt, for the first time in 5 years, like she knew what she was doing. "You knew what you were doing before you came here," Sandra said. "You kept records for 5 years. That is not nothing." "I did not know if anyone would ever read them," Dorothy said. "That is the gap," Sandra said. "Not the records. The belief that the records would matter." She looked at the folder on the table between them. "They matter. They always mattered. The question is always whether there is a path from the record to the outcome, and whether anyone knows how to walk it." "Do you?" Dorothy said. "I do," Sandra said. "And by the time we are done, so will you." Dorothy went back to her development with the 12-page guide and a plan and Sandra's cell number and the name of a Consumer Counsel staff attorney in her region who had been briefed on the preliminary situation. She called Sandra twice in the first week with specific questions about the records request process, and Sandra answered both calls and walked her through it, because that was the point. Gerald Marsh came over on the Saturday Dorothy had visited. He had brought a casserole, which was the kind of thing Gerald did, and they ate it at the newly refinished kitchen table and talked about the spring and the pool restoration, which was ahead of schedule, and the new landscaping contract that the board had awarded through a proper competitive bid process to a company with no relationship to any board member and a price that was, per James Okafor's comparative analysis, within normal market range. "What is the price per visit?" Sandra asked. $1,420, Gerald said. "And Hartwell Premier was charging?" $4,150. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the accumulated difference across 7 years multiplied across all the contracts that had run through the Hartwell entities, and she thought about what that money could have meant to the development. Proper pool maintenance and a repaired fitness center and a full reserve fund and no reason for anyone to have paid a fine for a mailbox or a hose or a ladder in a side yard. "The difference between 1,400 and 4,100 is not a rounding error," she said. "It is a decision to use the community's money as a private income source. That decision has a cost to every resident in this development and every year it operates." "I know," Gerald said. "Most of them never knew," she said. "They know now," he said. The May community meeting had 84 residents. Slightly fewer than the large peak meetings of the winter, but dramatically more than the 42 who had attended the September meeting that was Sandra's first. The agenda was ordinary: budget review, common area maintenance updates, pool reopening timeline, proposal for a community garden in the common area behind the East Loop, which had been suggested by Ann Weatherspoon at the March meeting and had gathered enough interest to warrant a formal proposal. Sandra sat at the board table and ran part of the meeting for the first time since being elected. She ran it the way she ran everything, which was to say directly and without ceremony, with the agenda on the screen behind her and the documents available and the questions from residents answered with the actual information they were asking for rather than with management language designed to sound like information while containing none. Howard stood up at the end of the meeting to ask about the pool. Not with the resigned expression of someone who has been told this same story too many times, but with the expression of someone who has decided to believe in the timeline and is verifying. "June 15th, Sandra said. "Inspection scheduled for the 10th. Contractor is on track." He nodded. He sat down. The expression on his face was something she had not seen from him before, the careful expression of someone who has decided to allow themselves a thing they had stopped allowing themselves, and who is watching to see if it gets taken away again. She thought, "It will not be taken away this time." She thought, not while she had anything to do with it. After the meeting, in the parking lot, a woman she did not know introduced herself as the wife of one of the board members from the previous administration. Not Craig or Patricia, but one of the others, a man named Devin who had been on the board for 3 years and had been, per the formal record, a passive participant in the governance failures of the Hartwell administration. His wife's name was Rachel and she was direct in the way of someone who has something to say and has thought carefully about whether to say it. She said, "Devin is going to vote for the transparency provisions and everything else the new board has proposed. He wanted you to know that he did not know. He knew things were not right, but he did not know how not right, and he did not know how to stop it." Sandra looked at her for a moment. "Tell him I believe that," she said. "And tell him the way to make it matter is to keep voting the right way, consistently, for as long as he is on the board." Rachel nodded. She said, "He wanted to say thank you." "He does not need to thank me," Sandra said. "He needs to do the work." Rachel almost smiled. "You sound like a teacher," she said. "My mother was a teacher," Sandra said. "I suppose some of it stuck." She drove home and put the windows of the house open for the first time, because the May evening was the kind of warm that deserved an open window, and she sat in the living room and listened to the development settling into its evening rhythm and thought about September, which was 7 months ago, and also, somehow, longer ago than that. She thought about the ladder and the primer and the first visit and the clipboard, and she thought about what had been true on that September day that she did not know yet, which was that the development she was moving into had been running for 7 years as a private extraction machine dressed as a community institution, and that changing it would require everything she had and more than a little of what others had, and that it would be done before the year was out. She thought about what had also been true on that September day, which was that she was ready for it, in ways she did not fully know until the work began, because readiness is not always visible to the person who has it until they are in the thing it prepared them for. She thought about Becca, 12 years old in the parking lot, saying, "So you just needed the FBI until you learned how to do it without them." She thought about Dorothy Weston and the 5 years of records and the call that had said, "I have been praying for someone to come." She thought about what it would take for Dorothy not to have to wait 5 years next time, not to have to wait at all, because the person across town already knew the rights and was already watching and already knew that keeping records was not pointless but was in fact the most essential thing a resident in that situation could do. She thought about the 12-page guide and the 200 downloads and what happened when knowledge moved through a network of people who needed it. She thought about the next folder with its subfolders, and the fact that she had added a fifth one that morning, and the fact that the fifth one had come from a referral from Claudia Reyes, which meant the formal oversight infrastructure was starting to see her work and trust it, which was a different kind of resource than anything she had started the year with. She sat in the living room with the windows open and the May evening coming in and the mockingbird doing what it did, which was to take everything it had heard and make something new from it, and she was grateful for the year and grateful for the house and grateful for the work, which was the same work it had always been, which was finding what was wrong and building the record that made it right, one document at a time, one resident at a time, in the patient and determined accumulation of a change that would outlast her and the specific situation that had produced it. The pool opened on June 14th, one day ahead of schedule. Howard was there when the gates opened, wearing the same canvas hat she had seen him in at every meeting, and he stood at the edge of the pool for a long moment and looked at the water and then turned around and looked at Sandra, who had come because she had said she would. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She stood beside him at the edge of the pool in the June morning and they both looked at the water for a moment, the way you look at something that has been made right after a long time of being wrong, the specific quality of looking that belongs to things that were supposed to be there and were not, and now are. Then he went in. Sandra stayed at the edge for a minute longer. She thought about the folder on her laptop and the work ahead and the 5 subfolders and Dorothy Weston and the 12-page guide and Becca and Maya and Gerald's shoebox and the shoeboxes that existed right now in other developments in other counties, full of records kept by people who had been paying attention and waiting for someone to show up who could read them. She thought about what it takes to be that person, and what it costs, and whether the cost is worth it. She had answered that question 7 months ago, in a September driveway, when she climbed down from a ladder and waited for a woman with a clipboard to come to her. She still thought she had answered it correctly. She turned and walked back toward the gate, because there was work to do, and she knew how to do it, and she had already started. The summer in Pinecrest Commons had a different quality from the fall. In the fall there had been the sharp edge of new things, the novelty of the house and the neighborhood and the conflict that had arrived before Sandra had fully unpacked. Summer was already familiar. She knew the streets by their morning light and their afternoon shadow. She knew which yard the tabby cat crossed on its rounds. She knew which sprinkler system was set too early and which neighbors were morning people and which were not. She knew Gerald Marsh's porch in the afternoon light and she knew Trish Kaminsky's schedule well enough to time a visit correctly and she knew Howard's particular corner of the pool area and the hours he favored. She knew the development and the way you know a place when you have decided to stay in it, which is a different and more specific knowledge than the way you know a place when you are only passing through. The board met monthly. The meetings were well attended by the standards of the old administration, which was to say that 40 to 50 residents came, which was not the exceptional numbers of the winter and spring but was a stable and engaged group that treated the meetings as something worth their time rather than something to be endured or avoided. The difference in the room was visible in the questions people asked, which were specific and factual and expected to receive specific and factual answers, and in the responses from the board, which were specific and factual because the board members understood that specificity and accuracy were now expected. Sandra ran those meetings with Gerald and Trish and Ann Weatherspoon, and she noticed over the summer that the 4 of them had settled into a working rhythm that was different from what she had expected. She had expected, based on the winter and spring, that her role would be primarily procedural and corrective, the person who knew the rules and kept the process clean. And that was part of it. But the bigger part, the part she had not fully anticipated, was the modeling. The way the 4 of them handled disagreement and uncertainty and information gaps at the board table showed the residents what the institution was supposed to look like, and the residents adjusted their expectations accordingly, and the expectations and the institution calibrated each other in the patient ongoing way of systems that are actually working. This was, Sandra thought, The slow work. The dramatic part had been the investigation and the arrest and the indictment and the audit. The slow work was the 100 meetings and the 100 small decisions made correctly in the ordinary operations of a community that had decided to function the way it was supposed to function. The slow work was less visible and less satisfying in the immediate sense and more important in the lasting sense. She had always known this intellectually. It was different to know it in practice, to sit at a board table on a Tuesday evening in July discussing the parking variance request and the summer maintenance schedule and the community garden proposal, and to understand that this was not less important than the fraud case. This was the thing the fraud case had been in service of. Maya came home for a week in July, which was the longest stretch she had spent at the house since Sandra moved in. She slept late and stayed up late and borrowed Sandra's running shoes and went running in the mornings, which she had never done before. She said the development was good for running because the loops were flat and the trees were good. The mockingbird woke me up at 6, she said one morning. It does that, Sandra said. I like it, Maya said. She poured coffee with the competence of someone who has been making her own coffee for 2 years. Dad asked me if you seem okay. What did you tell him? I told him you seem better than okay. She looked at her mother over the coffee cup. You seem like you are where you are supposed to be. Sandra thought about this. I did not know this was where I was supposed to be, she said. I just bought a house that needed work in a zip code I could afford. And then you fixed the zip code, Maya said. I did not fix it alone. No, Maya agreed, but you started it. They went for a run together that morning, side by side through the development loops in the July heat, and Sandra did not think about case files or board meetings or the next folder or anything except the road and the light and the sound of her daughters breathing beside her and the mockingbird in the red maple doing its morning work. Dorothy Weston called on a Thursday in late July to report that the formal records request had produced results, specifically that the management company in her development had provided a set of financial records that, when compared to the guidelines Sandra had sent her, contained the same kind of omissions and inconsistencies that Gerald Marsh's records had shown in Pinecrest Commons at the beginning. She had already contacted the Consumer Counsel staff attorney Sandra had recommended. The attorney had reviewed Dorothy's preliminary summary and said the situation warranted a formal complaint. She said it was one of the better documented preliminary complaints she had seen in a while, Dorothy told Sandra. You kept good records for 5 years, Sandra said. I kept records because you told me they would matter, Dorothy said. You kept them before I told you that, Sandra said. You kept them because you knew they mattered. I just told you I could see it. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Is that what you did here? Just told people you could see it? More or less, Sandra said. Plus a few hundred hours of work. Dorothy laughed for the first time in their conversations, the specific laugh of someone who has been dealing with something serious for so long that the permission to laugh about it is a relief. After the call, Sandra sat in the kitchen and thought about the phrase you just told people you could see it. There was a part of that which was true. A significant part of what had happened in Pinecrest Commons was the simple fact that someone with the relevant training had arrived, looked at the situation, and said out loud in a room full of people, I can see what this is, and I know what to do about it. The saying was not nothing. The seeing was not nothing. But neither was what people had done with it. What she had discovered over the course of the year was that people do not primarily need to be rescued. They need to be seen. They need someone to confirm that what they are experiencing is real, that the thing they have been told is just the way things work is not in fact just the way things work but is a choice someone has made that other choices can reverse. They need someone to say, the records you have been keeping matter, and here is how to use them. And then they need to be trusted to use them. Gerald had used them. Trish had used them. Dorothy was using them. Marcus Ellis was using them, having become, in the months since his first visit, one of the more reliable members of the Resident Oversight Committee, applying 30 years of accounting practice to the quarterly review of the association's financial records with the thoroughness of someone who had learned the hard way that thorough records are their own form of protection. In August, Sandra finished the upstairs bathroom tile. It had been on the list since she moved in and she had been saving it for a time when she had 3 clear days without other claims on them. And that time arrived in the second week of August when Maya had gone back to Richmond and the board schedule was light and the consulting work was in a quiet period. She pulled the old cracked tile and replaced it with something simple and good, the kind of work that required her hands and her eyes and nothing else, and while she worked she thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way the mind does when the body is occupied with something specific. When she finished she stood in the bathroom doorway and looked at the new tile and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly, the same satisfaction she had felt looking at the painted fence in April and the refinished kitchen floor in October and the porch ceiling that had started everything, which was correctly primed and correctly painted and entirely consistent with the standards of the development, which she had confirmed at every stage because she had learned over the course of the year that the best response to someone who uses rules as weapons is to know the rules better than they do and to follow them more precisely than they ever required you to. She had followed every rule. She had paid every fine that was legitimate, of which there were none. She had responded to every notice, attended every meeting, submitted every request through the correct channel with the correct citation and the correct documentation. She had done all of this not because the rules were always right but because the rules were the field on which the game was played, and you could not win on a field you refused to stand on. This was the thing she had tried to say at the March meeting and had said imperfectly, in the way that you always say the things that matter most imperfectly, because the things that matter most are too large to fit exactly into the words available. The rules are not the enemy. The rules are the tool. The question is always who has the tool and whether they know how to use it and who it is supposed to be used for. She had used the tool. She had used it for the people it was supposed to be used for. And she had tried, over the course of the year, to teach as many of those people as possible to use it themselves, because a tool that requires one person to operate it is more fragile than a tool that 100 people know how to use. That was the real lesson, not the case or the indictment or the governance reform, though those mattered and were real and would last. The real lesson was the 12-page guide and the Resident Oversight Committee and Howard understanding his rights and Becca in the parking lot and Dorothy Weston keeping records for 5 years and finally having someone to give them to. The real lesson was the distribution of knowledge to the people who needed it, and the trust that those people could use it, and the truth that they could. She thought about this for a long time in the August light of the upstairs bathroom, looking at the new tile, and then she went downstairs and made coffee and opened the next folder and started reading. There were 6 subfolders now. She had work to do. In the fall, exactly 1 year after she had moved in, Sandra painted the porch railing. She had been saving it. Not intentionally, not as a commemorative gesture, but it had simply not risen to the top of the list until now, which was how the house had worked all year, giving her the things she needed when she needed them and holding the rest in patient reserve. The railing was a dark green that had made sense in some prior decade and made less sense now, and she was replacing it with a quiet off-white, the same color as the fence and the porch ceiling, the color she had chosen in the first month from the approved palette and had kept to consistently because consistency was its own kind of argument. She was on the ladder when the Range Rover pulled up. It was not Diana Hartwell's Range Rover, because Diana Hartwell was in federal custody awaiting sentencing, and the Range Rover had been among the assets subject to the restitution order. This Range Rover was a neighbor's, a family that had moved into the development in June, the Yamamoto family, who had bought one of the houses that had gone on the market in the spring following the board transition, when several longtime residents who had been closely aligned with the previous administration had apparently decided it was time to move on. The Yamamoto daughter, who was 9 years old and had already adopted the mockingbird as a personal mascot, waved at Sandra from the car window. Sandra waved back from the ladder. She thought about September of last year. The ladder and the primer and the clipboard and the careful performance of authority that had been designed to make her feel that the space she was standing in was not quite hers. She thought about the specific engineering of that performance, the way it had been calibrated to produce a particular response, and she thought about the fact that it had not produced that response, and about why. It had not produced that response because she had spent 18 years learning to recognize the structure of the thing. She had recognized the lie inside the paint citation before she climbed down from the ladder. She had recognized the shell company structure in the vendor database before she finished the first evening of research. She had recognized the tactic in the harassment letter before she called Claudia Reyes. She had recognized all of it because she had been trained to recognize it and had spent a career applying that training, and the recognition was what had made everything else possible. The training was not available to everyone. The career was not available to everyone. But the knowledge was. The knowledge could be written down and shared and taught, and that was what the 12-page guide was and what the Resident Oversight Committee was and what the work with Dorothy Weston was and what all of it was building toward, however slowly and incompletely. The knowledge could move. She put the last stroke of paint on the railing and climbed down and looked at it. Off-white and right and exactly what she had planned, in the September light, in the house on the corner lot that was hers. Inside, her laptop was open to the next folder, which now had 7 subfolders. She would get to them in the order they needed attention, with the resources available and the judgment she had developed over a year of this particular kind of work. She would do it the way she did everything, which was carefully and persistently and with the full use of whatever she knew. The mockingbird in the red maple was conducting its morning argument. Sandra listened to it for a moment. Then she went inside and got to work.